The small town of Ashton, Mississippi, was known for its tight-knit community, charming Southern hospitality, and unwavering faith. At the heart of this devout town was the First Baptist Church, a place where everyone gathered on Sundays to worship and share in each other's lives. Leading this congregation was Pastor Samuel Thompson, a man revered by all for his wisdom, kindness, and steadfast commitment to God. Pastor Samuel, as he was affectionately called, was a pillar of the community. In his early 40s, he had been guiding the flock of First Baptist for nearly a decade. His wife, Anne, had tragically passed away from cancer 3 years earlier, and since then, Samuel had thrown himself even more into his work, finding solace in his faith and his congregation. But as respected as he was, there was something else that drew people to Pastor Samuel: his compassion. He was always there for his parishioners, offering guidance and support no matter the time of day. It was this very compassion that led him to help Margaret Hayes, a recent widow who had lost her husband in a car accident the previous year. Margaret, in her mid-30s, was struggling to adjust to life without her husband, David. The couple had been married for almost 15 years, and his sudden death had left her shattered. She sought comfort in the church and, more specifically, in the gentle words and unwavering support of Pastor Samuel. At first, it seemed like a perfectly innocent relationship. Samuel would visit Margaret to offer his condolences and pray with her. He would bring groceries when she was too overwhelmed to leave the house, and even helped organize a community fundraiser to cover some of her husband's medical bills. To the outside world, it was a touching display of Christian charity. But as time went on, the boundaries of their relationship began to blur. Late-night phone calls turned into whispered conversations filled with confessions of loneliness and unfulfilled desires. What started as a shoulder to cry on soon became something much more illicit. By the fall of 2011, their secret meetings had become a regular occurrence. Samuel would sneak away from the church after his evening sermons, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and guilt as he made his way to Margaret's house. They would talk for hours, their conversations filled with longing and pain, and then, inevitably, they would find themselves in each other's arms, seeking solace in the forbidden comfort of one another's touch. Their affair was passionate and all-consuming, but it was also fraught with tension. Samuel was torn between his love for Margaret and his role as a spiritual leader. He knew what they were doing was wrong, but the emptiness he felt after Anne's death seemed to fade when he was with Margaret. She made him feel alive again, like a man instead of just a pastor. For Margaret, the affair was an escape from the crushing loneliness that had enveloped her since David's death. She had loved her husband deeply, but in Samuel, she found a new kind of connection, one that was intoxicating and dangerous. He was everything she had admired from afar: strong, compassionate, and devoted. And now he was hers, even if it had to remain a secret. The risks they were taking were immense. Ashton was a small town where gossip spread like wildfire. If anyone found out, it would destroy Samuel's reputation and Margaret's fragile standing in the community. Yet, despite the danger, they couldn't seem to stop. They were drawn to each other like moths to a flame, fully aware that the fire would eventually consume them. And so, they continued their affair, careful to maintain the facade of their public lives. Samuel preached on Sundays, his voice filled with conviction as he spoke about morality and the sanctity of marriage, all while carrying the weight of his own hypocrisy. Margaret attended church regularly, her eyes fixed on him as he delivered his sermons, knowing that later that night they would be together, sharing a sin that felt impossible to resist. But secrets have a way of unraveling, no matter how carefully they're kept. And in a town as small as Ashton, it was only a matter of time before someone began to suspect that there was more to Pastor Samuel's late-night visits than just pastoral care. In the winter of 2012, whispers started to circulate. People noticed the way Margaret's eyes followed Samuel during the service, the way he seemed to linger a little too long when speaking to her after church. Some brushed it off as mere speculation, but others weren't so sure. The town was on edge, sensing that something was amiss, but not yet willing to believe that their beloved pastor could be involved in something so scandalous. As the rumors grew, so did the tension between Samuel and Margaret. What had once been a source of comfort now felt like a noose tightening around their necks. They knew they had to be more careful to put an end to their meetings, but the pull they felt towards each other was stronger than their fear of being caught. Then, on a cold February night, everything came came crashing down. Samuel had just left Margaret's house, his mind racing with guilt and shame, when he noticed a figure standing across the street, hidden in the shadows. Panic surged through him as he recognized the shape of the man, Thomas Miller, a deacon from the church and one of his closest confidants. Their eyes met briefly before Samuel turned and hurried away, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that Thomas had seen him, and he also knew that there would be no explaining this away. His carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The days following the encounter with Thomas were filled with dread for Samuel. Each Sunday service felt like a trial, with every pair of eyes in the congregation a potential accuser. Thomas hadn't said a word, but his silence was deafening. Samuel knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Margaret was equally terrified. She begged Samuel to speak to Thomas, to explain it away as something innocent, but deep down, they both knew there was no turning back. The pressure of keeping their affair hidden had finally caught up with them, and the consequences were spiraling out of control. On the night of February 20th, 2012, things reached a breaking point. Samuel had received a text from Thomas earlier that day, asking to meet at the church after hours. The message was curt and uncharacteristic, lacking the warmth Thomas usually conveyed. Samuel's heart sank. He knew this would be the confrontation he had been dreading. As he arrived at the dimly lit church, Samuel found Thomas waiting for him in the sanctuary, his face etched with disappointment and anger. The two men stood in the shadow of the pulpit, the very place where Samuel had preached countless sermons on honesty and fidelity, and now his lies were laid bare. "What were you doing at Margaret's house, Samuel?" Thomas's voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it that Samuel had never heard before. Samuel stammered, searching for words that wouldn't come. "It's not what you think, Thomas. I was just—" "Don't lie to me, Pastor," Thomas interrupted, the word pastor laced with irony. "I saw you leaving her house, late at night. You were there for more than just a prayer meeting, weren't you? There was no use denying it." Samuel took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "Yes, we've been involved, but it's over now, I swear." Thomas shook his head in disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've betrayed your wife's memory, this congregation, and God himself. How could you?" Samuel's voice cracked. "I know I've sinned, Thomas, but please, I beg you, don't tell anyone. It'll ruin everything." Thomas's eyes narrowed, his voice rising. "It's already ruined, Samuel. People have started talking. I don't know how much longer I can keep this quiet. What you've done is unforgivable." Fear gripped Samuel's heart. He could see his entire life unraveling before him. Desperation clouded his judgment. "Please, Thomas, there must be something I can do. Anything." Thomas stepped closer, his expression hardening. "You need to end this, Samuel. Leave the church, leave Margaret, confess your sins, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find some redemption." Samuel nodded, his mind racing. He had to end this affair, to salvage whatever remained of his life. But as he left the church that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late. The noose was already tightening around his neck. Meanwhile, Margaret was spiraling into her own despair. The fear of exposure had consumed her, and the thought of losing Samuel was unbearable. She couldn't bear the loneliness again, the cold emptiness that had followed David's death. In a desperate attempt to cling to what little they had left, she texted Samuel, begging him to come over. "I need to see you. We need to talk." "I can't do this without you," the message read. Samuel hesitated, but knew he had to end things once and for all. He made his way to Margaret's house, his mind clouded with guilt and fear. When he arrived, Margaret was waiting for him, her eyes red from crying. "You're going to leave me, aren't you?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Samuel swallowed hard, his heart aching at the sight of her pain. "We don't have a choice, Margaret. It's over. We can't keep doing this." Margaret's face contorted with anger and despair. "You're just going to walk away after everything? You said you loved me, Samuel. You promised. I do love you, but this is wrong. We have to stop," he pleaded, his voice breaking, but Margaret wasn't listening. She grabbed his arm, her grip tight and desperate. "No, we can't end it. I can't lose you too. You're all I have left." The argument escalated quickly, voices rising and emotions flaring. Margaret's desperation turned to rage, and in a fit of hysteria, she slapped Samuel across the face. Stunned, he staggered back, his own anger boiling to the surface. "This has to end, Margaret," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty house, but Margaret wouldn't back down. "If you leave me, I'll tell everyone. I'll tell them about us, about everything." Samuel froze. The threat hung in the air like a blade over his head. He couldn't let her destroy everything, couldn't let her ruin his life, his reputation. Panic took hold, and before he knew what he was doing, his hands were around her throat. "Stop it, Margaret. Please don't do this," he begged, his grip tightening despite his words, but she didn't stop. She fought back, clawing at his hands, gasping for breath. And then, in a horrifying moment of clarity, he realized what he was doing. He released her, but it was too late. Margaret collapsed to the floor, her body lifeless, eyes wide with shock. Samuel stumbled back, his mind reeling. He had killed her. The woman he claimed to love, the woman he had destroyed his life for, was now dead at his hands. For a moment, he stood there, paralyzed with horror. And then, the reality of what he had done crashed over him like a wave. He needed to get out, to cover his tracks. His mind raced as he scrambled to erase any trace of his presence. He wiped down surfaces, deleted their text messages, and finally, with trembling hands, placed a Bible in Margaret's lap, a twisted gesture of remorse and guilt. Then, he fled the scene, his heart pounding, the weight of his crime crushing him with every step. The morning after Margaret's murder, Samuel sat in his office at the church, his mind a fog of fear and regret. He had spent the night sleepless, replaying the horrific scene over and over in his mind. His hands still shook as he tried to steady himself, knowing it was only a matter of time before someone discovered her body. It wasn't long before the call came. Margaret's neighbor, concerned that she hadn't seen her that morning, had gone to check on her. When there was no answer, she let herself in and found Margaret's lifeless body slumped on the floor, the Bible resting eerily in her lap. Within minutes, the house was swarming with police. Detective Laura Hayes, a seasoned investigator with the Mississippi State Police, arrived at the scene. She quickly assessed the situation, noting the signs of a struggle, the overturned furniture, the broken vase, and most damning of all, the faint bruises on Margaret's neck. It was clear this was no accident. As the investigation unfolded, the town of Ashton buzzed with shock and speculation. A murder in their quiet community was unthinkable, and the fact that the victim was Margaret Hayes only added to the scandal. Whispers spread like wildfire, and soon enough, people were questioning the frequent visits of Pastor Samuel to her home. Despite the secrecy of their affair, the truth was beginning to unravel. Detective Hayes wasted no time interviewing Samuel. He tried to maintain his composure, but his guilt was palpable. When asked about his relationship with Margaret, he stammered through a rehearsed lie, claiming he had been counseling her through her grief. But his story didn't hold up. The more Hayes pressed, the more cracks appeared in his facade. The breakthrough came when a thorough examination of Margaret's phone revealed a series of deleted messages between her and Samuel. Hayes had them recovered, and what she found was damning. Intimate texts that detailed their affair and the fight they'd had the night before she was killed. It was enough to bring Samuel in for further questioning. Back in the interrogation room, Samuel's calm demeanor began to crumble. Hayes presented the recovered messages, each one another nail in his coffin. She didn't have to press hard. The guilt and fear were already eating him alive. He broke down, sobbing as he confessed to the murder, claiming it had been an accident, that he hadn't meant to kill her. "I just wanted to make her stop," he cried, his voice shaking. "I didn't want to lose everything, but now I've lost it all anyway." Hayes listened impassively. There was no sympathy left for the man who had betrayed his community and his faith. She arrested him on the spot, and within hours, the news spread through Ashton like wildfire. Pastor Samuel Thompson had been charged with the murder of Margaret Hayes. The trial that followed was swift and brutal. The prosecution painted Samuel as a hypocrite, a man who had used his position of trust to pursue a forbidden affair and, when faced with exposure, had chosen murder to silence his lover. The defense's argument that it was a crime of passion, not premeditated murder, did little to sway the jury. In the end, the evidence was overwhelming. Samuel was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 20 years. The verdict brought a sense of closure to some, but for the town of Ashton, the scars would remain for years to come. The fallout was devastating. First Baptist Church lost its leader and its reputation in one fell swoop. Parishioners struggled to reconcile the man they had admired with the murderer they now saw in the news. Samuel's remaining family, his children from his marriage to Anne, were left to bear the shame of his actions, while Margaret's family mourned the loss of a woman they barely recognized anymore. As Samuel sat in his cell, staring at the cold concrete walls, he was haunted by the faces of those he had failed: his late wife, his children, and Margaret. He had destroyed everything in his selfish pursuit of comfort, and now, alone and disgraced, he had nothing left but his guilt. The once beloved pastor who had stood in front of his congregation, preaching about love and redemption, was now a cautionary tale of how easily one could be consumed by sin. The community he left behind was forever changed, the shadow of his betrayal lingering long after he was gone. And for those who had once called him a friend, a leader, a man of God, there was only one lesson to be learned: even the most righteous among us can fall, and when they do, they can bring down everyone around them.